Bonjour tout le monde. Je veux commencer par remercier le Premier ministre Kishida et le Japon pour leur accueil. Les pays du G7 sont nos alliés, nos amis les plus proches. On a eu une semaine très productive. On a parlé d'économie, de sécurité, de lutte contre les changements climatiques et de plusieurs autres sujets qui sont importants pour nos populations et pour le monde. This week, with our G7 allies, we reaffirmed our support for Ukraine. As you know, on Thursday, Canada imposed new sanctions on individuals and entities that provide military technology to Russia's armed forces or that are involved in ongoing human rights violations, including the transfer of Ukrainian children to Russia. I had the opportunity to speak directly with President Zelenskyy in person, and I can say it was really great to see him again. We speak every few weeks, but being able to sit down with him as he continues to lead through this extraordinarily difficult time, as he continues to embody the courage, the strength, and the resilience of the Ukrainian people, made it a real privilege to be able to sit down and reconnect with him. He provided an update of the situation on the ground. We talked about how important it was to continue to reach out to partners around the world and friends to ensure the solidarity and the support for Ukraine and for the principles that underpin the peace, stability, and prosperity that we've had in this world over the past many, many decades. What we saw around the table, including with outreach partners, is a solid commitment to obeying the UN Charter, to respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states, and that is the basis on which we will be able to move forward. Of course, for our part, Canada will continue to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people with everything it takes for as long as it takes. Of course, meeting here in Hiroshima was symbolic, and it served as a reminder of the devastating consequences of war. This week, the G7 issued the Hiroshima Vision on Nuclear Disarmament, in which we condemned Russia's reckless nuclear rhetoric. The threat of nuclear weapons is also very real here in the North Pacific. Security and stability in the region is an important part of our Indo-Pacific strategy. This is why we announced this week that Canada is investing in projects to help identify, investigate, and respond to North Korea's activities related to weapons of mass destruction. We also announced additional funds for the International Atomic Energy Agency to continue monitoring Iran's nuclear commitments. Bien sûr, quand on parle de sécurité dans le monde, on doit aussi parler de sécurité économique. Une de nos priorités avec nos alliés du G7 est de continuer à renforcer nos chaînes d'approvisionnement. Le Canada va continuer de jouer un rôle clé, particulièrement avec nos minéraux critiques qui sont essentiels pour bâtir une économie propre et résiliente. Que ce soit en raison de la guerre, de la pandémie ou des changements climatiques, on voit les conséquences de cette instabilité sur nos économies et sur nos citoyens. On est tous d'accord qu'il faut aussi continuer de se protéger contre les pays autoritaires qui se servent de leur pouvoir économique pour exercer des pressions injustes sur les autres. C'est pour ça qu'on a lancé cette semaine une plateforme qui va nous aider à coordonner notre approche contre la coercition économique. If we want the world to be more stable, we must also continue to work to close the infrastructure and investment gap in low and middle-income countries. We had a meeting about exactly that yesterday, in which we reaffirmed the G7's goal to mobilize up to $600 billion by 2027 for the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. As a part of this, for example, Canada is investing in projects that include solar grids and village electrification. This will grow the economy and create good jobs for people. It will help reduce poverty, and it will also help fight climate change and achieve our sustainable development goals. Canada has come to Hiroshima to encourage greater ambition and unity within the G7 on a way forward to meet the needs of emerging and developing economies. We are listening and we are taking action, including by working together to make international financial institutions deliver for for all countries. Les leaders que j'ai rencontrés cette semaine reconnaissent que notre monde est dans une période critique. Les membres du G7 vont continuer d'apporter de l'aide humanitaire à ceux qui en ont besoin, tout en luttant contre l'insécurité alimentaire. Plus que jamais, dans cette période critique, non seulement il faut affronter les obstacles urgents, mais il faut aussi prendre des décisions stratégiques pour bâtir un meilleur avenir pour tous. Summits like these are an important moment to coordinate our efforts to strive for a better future for all people. In this consequential moment for the world, the G7 continues to be united and resolved. Thank you, everyone. Now happy to take your questions.
Nous allons maintenant commencer avec la période des questions. One question, one follow-up. First question goes to Glenn McGregor.
Prime Minister, your first event here in Hiroshima was visiting the atomic bomb memorial. I wonder how you think that experience for yourself and other leaders colored the discussions about dealing with nuclear powers like Russia, China, Iran, and maybe North Korea.
Most of us don't remember a time where the world was under threat by nuclear war. The Cold War ended a long time ago, and the danger of nuclear war is unfortunately being forgotten by many. That's why Prime Minister Kishida's decision to come here, not just to his hometown, but to a place that remembers all too well the devastating impacts of nuclear war, was really important. As was pointed out, Russia's reckless nuclear rhetoric around its invasion of Ukraine, the growing instability posed by regular military and nuclear threats by North Korea, and even the uncertainty of Iran and other growing nuclear powers, means we need to take very, very seriously the threats to global peace and security that are around us right now. And that was an opportunity not just for the G7, but for our outreach and partner countries to recommit themselves, not just to a world free of nuclear weapons, but one free of the conflict and dangers of war.
The U.S. has approved Zelensky's request to give him F-16s and start training Ukrainian pilots. Does you support that decision? Are you concerned that NATO aircraft or aircraft from NATO countries being involved in the conflict could be seen as an escalation? And also, do you see any role for Canada in potentially training?
Canada is already engaged in a broad range of training exercises with the Ukrainian military, and we're always looking for to do more, and we're certainly not opposed to helping in all sorts of different ways in training Ukrainian soldiers and potentially pilots. In regards to the military supplies, the G7 nations and others are delivering to Ukraine. Had we not been there with significant military support, Ukraine would not be standing today. And Ukraine continuing to fight for and fight effectively for its territorial integrity and its sovereignty is also about all of us collectively standing up for foundational principles in the world, like territorial integrity and sovereignty and the UN Charter. So we will not hesitate to continue to ensure that Russia does not succeed in making might make right once again in this world.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Ashley Burke, CBC News. What specifically did you say to other G7 leaders about foreign interference involving China?
Foreign interference is a fact of life in all of our democracies. It is nothing new. When Canada hosted the G7 in 2018, we actually put forward a rapid response mechanism designed to respond to foreign interference in our democracies, running on the examples of the interference in the US 2016 election and the interference in the 2017 French presidential election. We knew that interference by China and other countries was real and challenging in all of our countries, in our democracies, in our democratic institutions, in our academic institutions and our research facilities, in our businesses and supply chains. Canada, over the past many years, has taken significant steps to ensure the integrity of our last two elections with the mechanism we brought in 2019, with different bodies, including oversight of our national security agencies by parliamentarians from all different parties. But it is something we need to continue to coordinate on as allies and friends. This is certainly something that I shared in terms of sharing best practices, sharing the challenges to our democracies, and sharing how we can continue to coordinate and work together so that countries who wish to interfere in our democracies, in our institutions, know that we are watching and we are ready to respond.
What specifically did you say to G7 leaders, though? There is a line in the communique about foreign interference, and what did G7 leaders say in response? Was there support or not?
If it's in the communique, there was
Sorry,
support.
What kind of support was there?
There was a clear understanding and support that this is something that we have to grapple with. We were very clear in the communique as well that dealing with China is something we're all going to have to do. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be engaging with China in many important ways. Canada recently hosted the COP15 on biodiversity in Montreal, but we co-hosted it with China, and we got significant headway on protecting biodiversity around the world. So there are areas in which we're going to have to coordinate and cooperate with China. In other ways, we're going to have to be competitive and compete on economic levels and others. But there are areas we're going to have to challenge China on, and that's on human rights violations on their territory and around the world, but also on interference in our own economies, in our own democracies, in our own research and intellectual property. And there was agreement, as is shown by the fact that it's in the communique, the joint statement by the G7.
Hi, Prime Minister Brian Platt with Bloomberg. This morning you met with the leaders of Ukraine and Brazil in bilateral meetings. When it comes to demanding that Russia leave Ukrainian territory, we know that President Lula does not share the strong stance that you and other G7 leaders have. So what was the tenor of your conversation with him on that, both in your meeting and in the broader session? Do you detect any shift in his position or any hope for a shift in his position?
There was a lot of discussion in the session by some of our partner countries and outreach countries about UN reforms, the need to strengthen the UN's ability to deal with conflicts and even wars, because that's what the UN was created for all those many decades ago. And yes, there is absolutely a need for reform, for improvements, for strengthening of the UN's capacity to deal with significant challenges and conflicts between nations and around the world. But I pointed out that we have to be very, very clear-eyed about this. The UN is in a challenging position right now because one of the members of the Security Council of the United Nations deliberately and willfully chose to violate the very principles and the charter that is at the founding of the UN. And worse, Russia, which chose to violate the UN Charter, has a veto over actions that the Security Council could take to respond to it. So simply saying the UN should do more, point out the UN voted overwhelmingly and massively to condemn 141 different countries to condemn Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And yes, there are important and robust conversations happening around the world with different partners with different perspectives, but to look at the ground that we are standing, all of us, very firmly on, all the partner countries here at this G7 agreed to the following statement: we support a just and durable peace based on respect for international law, the principles of the UN Charter, and territorial integrity and sovereignty. So there is no question that Russia has violated those foundational principles, that Russia is the aggressor in this situation and must be held responsible for that. And then there are questions of how to build a lasting peace. Well, where do we go from here? And I propose a simple thought experiment to say, okay, we want this war to be over, we want there to be peace. What would happen if Ukraine, if the Ukrainian soldiers were to lay down their arms tomorrow and back away from the front lines? Would the integrity of the UN Charter be respected then? Would the Ukrainian people's sovereignty and ability to choose their own future be respected? Would this conflict end if Ukraine simply stopped fighting tomorrow? No. Now let's flip it around. What would happen if tomorrow Russia were to lay down its arms, back away from the front lines? The war would end. Peace would be restored. There would be many conversations about next steps. But anyone who wants lasting peace needs to recognize that it is Russia that is continuing to violate these fundamental principles upon which all countries agree. It is Russia that is continuing to perpetuate this, with bombs falling on Kyiv as recently as the past few days. There is no equivalency here, saying, oh, everyone should agree to a ceasefire, everyone should stop fighting. It is Russia that can end this war tomorrow if they stop trying to invade a peaceful neighbor. It's that simple. And there are people calling for a ceasefire as well. The ceasefire has led to the past 5 years, or 7 years, since 2014, of deaths in the Donbass, of occupation of Ukrainian territory. It's not a ceasefire that is needed. It is peace. And that peace can only be achieved if Russia decides to stop its ongoing invasion of a sovereign neighbor. Oh, tout à fait. Il y a eu beaucoup de conversations sur les défis au niveau des Nations Unies, le besoin de réforme au niveau des Nations Unies. Effectivement, on ne voit pas que les Nations Unies ont un rôle assez fort à jouer pour encourager les paix. On a de la misère aux Nations Unies, malgré 141 pays qui ont voté ensemble, la vaste majorité des pays dans le monde, pour condamner l'invasion illégale de la Russie. Mais soyons très clairs, les Nations Unies trouvent ça difficile d'agir à la hauteur du moment parce qu'un membre du Conseil de sécurité des Nations unies, la Russie, a choisi de violer les principes fondamentaux et la Charte des Nations unies. Et en plus, ils ont un droit de veto pour empêcher que le Conseil de sécurité puisse agir. Alors, ne nous trompons pas, on est dans une situation où les Nations unies ne peuvent pas agir, ont de la misère à agir à cause de la Russie et du choix que la Russie a fait. C'est pour ça que c'est une bonne nouvelle que tous les pays ici aujourd'hui, représentant les différents continents, représentant bien d'autres pays eux-mêmes, ont reconnu que le droit international, les principes de souveraineté, d'intégrité territoriale et la Charte des Nations unies se doivent être respectés. Et c'est comme ça qu'on va développer la paix. Et pour ceux qui pensent que pour la paix, il faut que les gens arrêtent de se battre, je suis d'accord, mais pas avec un cessez-le-feu. Il faut que la Russie se retire de la ligne de front, il faut qu'il se retire du territoire ukrainien. Si on imaginait, par exemple, que les Ukrainiens, demain, déposeraient leurs armes, arrêteraient de se battre, est-ce qu'on aurait la fin du conflit? Non. Parce que la Russie est en train de violer les principes, la souveraineté, le libre choix du peuple ukrainien, est en train d'occuper un voisin paisible. Ce n'est pas ça qui mettra fin à la guerre. Mais si la Russie, demain, décidait d'arrêter de se battre, de se retirer du front, bien, les Ukrainiens arrêteraient de se battre aussi, auraient plus besoin de défendre leur territoire. C'est pour ça qu'on ne peut pas faire une fausse équivalence de dire, OK, c'est les Ukrainiens et les Russes qui doivent chercher la paix. C'est sûr, les Ukrainiens veulent la paix. Ils sont en train de se faire envahir par leurs voisins. La seule façon de créer une paix durable à partir de maintenant, c'est que la Russie décide d'arrêter son invasion illégale d'un voisin paisible.
Follow-up?
I mean, so that's a very clear argument and a passionate argument you just laid out. So why do you think it hasn't resonated with some members of the Global South, with some of the countries that were here? Do you need, what is the best strategy to bring them around on this question?
Well, I think, first of all, that the emerging economies here today and leaders like leaders in the global economy like India, Brazil, Indonesia, and others agree that the UN Charter and territorial integrity and the sovereignty of peoples needs to be respected. Well, that's a common ground that allows us to actually move towards peace. That allows us, gives us a significant starting point to actually hold Russia to account for its illegal invasion. And we've heard time and time again that the impact of Russia's war is hurting people around the world with higher food prices, higher energy prices, disrupted supply chains, uncertainty, loss of resources. Absolutely. And that's why the G7 is stepping up in significant ways to be there with investments, to invest further in food security, to make sure we're building infrastructure and we're supporting people around the world. And we're going to continue to. But this is a conflict that, because of Russia's decisions, has a negative impact on countries around the world, but also puts at risk countries around the world. How many countries are there that are, at least in the back of their mind, worried because their neighbor has a bigger army than them, or because they have a little corner of their own territory that actually speaks the neighbor's language more than it speaks their own. The lines on a map that we live by, and that we have lived by for the decades since World War II, may in some cases seem fairly arbitrary and may not really align with realities, cultural, linguistic, religious realities on the ground. But we have agreed to abide by them because that's the only way to prevent the world from descending into constant attempts to redraw the maps. So Russia's attempt to unilaterally redraw the map of Ukraine, take Ukraine back into Russian territory like it was hundreds of years ago, should be and is of concern to every country in the world. But at the same time, the G7 and wealthy economies around the world need to step up, not just to deal with the own challenges that our own citizens are facing in terms of inflation, higher food prices, and higher energy prices. We have to be there to support countries around the world who are struggling with it as well, because that's the only way we hold this consensus together and build a stronger consensus that the UN Charter has to stand. Murray.
Prime Minister Murray Brewster with CBC. I always end up with the defense policy questions for some strange reason.
And there's a strange reason that you're sort of an expert in that.
President Zelenskyy gave you an assessment of his military and financial needs, the immediate needs. The latest federal budget does not contain any additional money for military donations to Ukraine. Is it fair to say that we are tapped out in terms of military donations to Ukraine?
No. As I've said many, many times, we will be there as long as it takes, with as much as it takes for Ukraine. Right now, the Rochelle armored vehicles are being delivered to Ukraine from Canada. We have 8 Leopard 2 tanks being delivered. We have thousands, if not tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition flowing into Ukraine. We will continue to train Ukrainian military, as we have been doing since 2015, to make sure they can continue to stand toe-to-toe against overwhelmingly larger forces that Russia is throwing at them. And as I said to Volodymyr today, as I will continue to say, Canada will continue to do everything necessary to make sure that Ukraine has the tools necessary to continue to hold and to take back their territory.
As a follow-up, Prime Minister, I recognize that we're at the G7 and not NATO, but in your conversations with allies this weekend, do you get the sense from them that Canada could suffer consequences for not meeting the NATO target of 2%?
What we talked about over the past number of days was how we will continue to be stepping up. And Canada, having increased its defense spending by 70% over the past years and into the coming years, the fact that we're continuing to step up in theaters around the world, and the fact that Canadian women and men serving in our armed forces continue to be highly respected and valued by partners around the world, whether it's in Latvia or elsewhere. We're going to continue to step up. We're going to continue to look for ways to do more to make sure that Ukraine and democracies and the values that we stand for as a country continue to prevail.
Hi, Mr. Trudeau. Mackenzie Gray with Global. At the beginning of your meeting with the Italian Prime Minister, you said you had concerns about LGBTQ issues there. Can you tell us what issues you raised specifically with her?
It's an issue that matters deeply to me and to Canadians, and I said what was necessary to be said. But at the same time, I can say that the work that we've been doing as a G7 on promoting shared values that we have around democracy, around standing up for what's right, on growing inclusive economies, on ensuring that we are sharing and investing in the global south and in emerging economies. We are strongly united and firm in the responsibilities we have to continue to step up. In particular, with Prime Minister Maloney, I highlighted that Canadians are heartbroken by the devastating floods that caused her to have to leave early to be back with Italians at this time, and committed that Canadians with a strong and vibrant Italian-Canadian community would be there to offer any and all support necessary as they deal with this further example of the impact of extreme weather events and the increased frequency because of climate change.
She was not very happy with you bringing this issue up. Today she said that you were a victim of fake news and propaganda on that. What's your response to that?
I think there are always going to be things that we disagree on, even as friends. But the most important thing is that we keep having open dialogues and we continue to engage on the things that matter, not just to our citizens, but people around the world. And that's what we've been doing together as a G7, and that's what we will continue to do as partners and friends.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau, Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Le président Zelenskyy voulait être ici notamment pour rencontrer les dirigeants des pays émergents. Est-ce que sa présence ici a changé la dynamique de la conversation? Qu'est-ce que vous avez remarqué comme différence?
Oh, certainement, ça a changé la dynamique de la conversation. C'est très marquant pour n'importe qui de rencontrer M. Zelenskyy, de l'entendre parler avec une telle passion de la défense de son pays, de sa culture, de son identité, de parler des atrocités que la Russie continue de commettre, les violations des droits de la personne, l'enlèvement des enfants, les meurtres atroces d'innocents et de soldats. C'était très important que le premier ministre Kishida inclue M. Zelenskyy. C'était très important pour le monde de pouvoir l'entendre et ça a été particulièrement puissant parce que depuis la dernière année, nos rencontres du G7 ont toujours eu la présence de Volodymyr, mais de l'avoir ici en personne, ça a été encore plus marquant.
Ma question était aussi surtout quel effet ça peut avoir sur la dynamique avec les pays du Sud, donc je vous laisse la chance de reprendre ce petit bout-là, mais aussi au niveau de nos alliés militaires. On parle de F-16, on parle davantage d'armement. Au Canada, on semble plutôt mettre l'accent sur formation, sanctions, reconstruction. Pourquoi c'est suffisant?
Tout d'abord, on verra dans les conversations à venir, dans les semaines à venir, comment on va continuer de travailler pour créer une paix durable et juste avec l'Ukraine qui est en train de choisir et de décider, de déterminer quelles seront les conditions et l'impact et les modalités de cette paix. Et c'est des conversations que nous allons continuer d'avoir avec les pays partenaires qui étaient ici, parce que c'est une conversation qui doit impliquer tout le monde. Et oui, le Canada fait énormément de formations. Depuis 2015, on a formé plus de 35 000 soldats ukrainiens, ce qui a contribué, avec le travail semblable qu'avont fait plusieurs de nos alliés, qui a contribué énormément à la capacité de l'armée ukrainienne de tenir contre la vague énorme des forces russes. Et oui, on est là pour la formation, oui, on est là avec de l'aide humanitaire, oui, on est là avec de l'aide financière pour pouvoir permettre de faire fonctionner le pays. On est là pour des investissements en infrastructure, pour remettre à point leur réseau énergétique et les infrastructures civiles qui ont été endommagées par la Russie et par ses attaques. Mais on est aussi là avec des fournitures militaires. On est là avec nos alliés pour livrer ce qu'on peut et pour travailler avec nos alliés pour livrer tout ce que nous pouvons faire ensemble. Parce que nous allons être là pour appuyer l'Ukraine aussi longtemps que ça prendra. Parce que ce n'est pas juste leur conflit, ils sont en train de se battre pour les principes qui soutiennent la paix et la stabilité dans le monde.
We have time for one more question and follow-up.
Hi, Prime Minister. It's Nuju Donnelly from the Canadian Press. My first question is about China. There's a whole passage on China specifically, and it seems like the G7 countries are trying to walk this line by saying that they plan to diversify their economies away from China, so become less dependent, but at the same time being very clear that you don't plan to part ways with China, economically speaking. Can you explain why that distinction was made and what exactly it means in a way that an average Canadian could understand? And also, how would diversifying away from China not ultimately hurt its economy?
China is the world's second largest economy and is continuing to grow in significant ways. We cannot simply choose to ignore China's existence. Its contributions to global supply chains, its contributions to economic success and goods and services everywhere around the world are significant. And we're not looking to reverse that. We're not setting out to try and make China fail or shrink. That's not what's interesting to us. What is interesting to countries of the G7 is to make sure that our supply chains are more resilient and diversified. We saw what happened during the global pandemic when supply chains built and designed for maximum just-in-time efficiency got massively disrupted. We saw what happened when countries didn't have a certain amount of manufacturing capacity within their own borders or within their closest allies. Economic security means having different options, having resilience in our supply chains. And that's something that's ultimately good for the entire world when there are multiple ways of ensuring the goods, the ingredients in our economic futures. Then when there are shocks or challenges or extreme weather events or conflicts in different parts of the world doesn't grind to a halt. So that's a big part of it. But at the same time, countries like Canada and our allies want to make sure that as we continue to grow and prosper and deliver for our citizens, we're delivering good jobs, but we're also delivering on the values that people care about. That environmental responsibility and sustainability and how things are made matters to us. And China still has a long way to go on that. That making sure we're buying products and services that pay good living wages in countries that respect human rights. These are values that we all understand. And that's the role we can play. And quite frankly, if the world starts saying, no, there needs to be a certain threshold of environmental responsibility and accountability, and there needs to be a quality level of protection for workers, and there needs to be a respect for human rights, and it forces China or encourages China to rise to meet those standards, everybody wins. We're dealing with challenges of climate change. We're dealing with the challenges of hollowed out middle classes, people who don't get the great jobs needed to grow our economies and feel political stability. These are things that we care about, and this is something we can do by ensuring the resilience and the interconnectedness that isn't entirely dependent on any single country.
And my second question builds on previous questions about the Global South. Them being here, a big point of that was to bring them closer to the G7 side and to have Zelenskyy here help with that pitch against, Russia and China. And it's not clear that anything concrete happened from what you're saying. So I'm just wondering, was this meant to be a conversation opener with these countries?
No, this is the continuation of a conversation that we didn't even start last year in Elmau, that we started well before that. This is a conversation that recognizes that the multiple shocks we've faced as a world over the past number of years, whether it's climate change and the extreme weather events that come with it, whether it's a global pandemic that turned our lives upside down, whether it's the war in Ukraine that's putting into question the UN Charter and the foundational principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, whether it's the economic slowdown, the inflation crises that come with it. There are a lot of things that are knocking around all of our citizens, everyone around the world. But the greatest impact, the greatest negative impact of all those things are on the world's poorest, are on the world's most vulnerable. And if there's one thing we've learned from these many, many crises we've just gone through, is that we're all connected deeply around the world, much more than we ever gave credit for in previous decades. And that if we want people in Canada to be doing well in the coming generations, we're going to need to make sure that people in emerging economies, people in small island developing states, people in low-lying coastal areas, people in conflict or famine-ravaged areas have opportunities to succeed, to see a better future for their kids, to be able to contribute to the economic well-being of their communities. Everything is interconnected, and those countries that are fortunate enough to sit around the G7 table as the largest, most developed economies in the world and the strongest democracies, we have to be consequential in our responsibility to support and to invest and to partner in emerging economies. One of the challenges we've faced as a world over the past few decades is that we lacked integrity in the way we patted ourselves on the back, saying that democracies with open market economies are the best model. Well, they were certainly the best model for us, but they weren't a true model because too much of the prosperity of successful, wealthy democracies relied on supply chains that came from places that didn't have the kinds of values or protections for their citizens or environmental responsibilities or freedom for their citizens around the world. And we have to be more consequential. We have to understand that if, as we believe, our values of freedom, openness, of opportunity, of democracies and people's right to choose their forms of their governments and their futures is the right model, it has to be the right model the whole way through. And that's where our constructive, positive engagement, our capacity to flow significant amounts of capital to the global south, to emerging economies, is so important. Because the fact is, our G7 economies understand that it's not a zero-sum game. That as we create success and stability and opportunity and peace for countries around the world, it'll have direct beneficial impacts on our citizens as well. That's what we've been missing over the past many decades. That's been the challenges of globalization. And instead of just throwing up our hands and saying, well, it's all broken, we need to start anew, it's like, no. We can lean in and build together a world in which there are real opportunities for citizens in all of our partner countries who are here and in emerging economies around the world to actually be part of the success that we are all and must all be building together.
That's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you
very
for your
much, everyone.
participation.
Merci.